Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second session today. And we hope you've enjoyed Irvin's session last night on Could the Final 7 Years Begin in 2020? And our session this morning on the election topics. And I kind of like doing this because I feel a whole lot more relaxed than being on the radio. I don't know why, but I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. And we pray that your hope for the end time has been enhanced in each of these sessions. Now, although we could analyze the ongoing fulfillment of many prophecies, proving that we're in the end time, because it is such a huge topic, today I'm only going to focus on two of these prophecies, the end time world government and the mark of the beast. Prophecies foretell a time in the near future when every person will be required to have a universally recognized, unique identification number in order to participate in society. And the compulsory, not a voluntary, but a compulsory numbering system will be administered by the Antichrist and his global governing system. In the early stages of this system, receiving a number is going to seem harmless. I mean, we all have numbers, right? And it will be just another number, not unlike a debit card or a Social Security number, but it's going to be used to function in everyday life. Now, most nations currently function under a national ID system, which allows their citizens access to government subsidies, financial transactions, health care, insurance, education, travel, all sorts of things. Well, the prophecies also foretell the establishment of a world government ruled by the Antichrist just prior to the second coming of Jesus Christ and the Battle of Armageddon. So once the Antichrist assumes full control of the world government, this numbering system will be turned into a method of control. Now, they're just setting up the system now, and it's not a method of control, but at that time it will be. It's going to change. So right in the beginning, it's going to seem harmless, but it's not going to end up that way. Now, judging by the current moves towards a cashless society, and I'll get into that here in a little bit, it's likely that by then, most purchases will be made digitally. We're already headed in that direction. And everyone will rely on their particular number for even the most basic essentials. And without it, no one will be able to legally buy or sell or function in society. Now, in order for an individual's number to remain active, he or she will be forced to worship or pledge allegiance to the Antichrist and his system. According to the Scripture, this is the exact individual economic sanctioning model that will be used by the Antichrist to force the world into compliance to his global governing structure. So the prophecies found in Revelation 13, 16 through 18. The Bible says, "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that has understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666, 666. So prior to the invention of the computer, and more specifically, the internet, this was not possible. So only within the last, 3 or 4 decades has this global numbering system really been possible? And it's a 2,000-year-old prophecy. And now we're coming up to the time when, on God's prophetic timeline, when it's supposed to be fulfilled. Remember, we're talking about the proof that we're in the end time. Now, both the World Bank, which is, they have the ID40 initiative, and the United Nations, which is working with ID 2020, are endeavoring to issue a unique digital identities or identification numbers to the 1 billion, what they would consider as invisible people who have no legal identification on the planet, which means they consider the other 6.5 billion plus citizens of this world, you and me, to be already legally numbered. So imagine the scope of that project. Who could manage such a numbering system? Not each individual government. So it's going to need to be an international organization, right? So the Secure ID News, they published an article, Projects that Aim for Legal Identity for Everyone. They stated that ID 2020 and ID 40 by the World Bank aim to bring legal binding digital IDs to all the world's citizens. The purpose of ID 2020 is to nurture public-private partnerships that can create an opportunity for emerging technology to connect with organizations that are working towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals, 16.9 specifically, which says legal identity for all. And like ID 2020, the Sustainable Development Goals 16.9 also drives the World Bank's initiative ID 40. So both of these are working to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have the world government providing universal, unique digital identities to every person in 2020. A 2,000-year-old prophecy. And so it sounds prophetic, doesn't it? Proof we're in the end time. Now, it gets much more detailed than that. So what's the goal driving this all-inclusive numbering scheme? The Sustainable Development Goals. You say, well, what's that? Well, the Sustainable Development Goals were unanimously adopted by 193 member states of the United Nations, including the United States under the Obama administration, on September 25th, 2015. The goals make up the international community's 15-year socialistic blueprint of global governance for every person on the earth. That's right, United States citizens. Now, I know we've got people all over the world watching this afternoon with me, but a lot of people, they've been functioning under, in other countries, have been functioning under these national ID cards and things like this for years. So they think it's something normal. Well, in the United States, we haven't. So when I say, you know, they're wanting to put these number system in the United States, a lot of us go, whoa, hold on a minute. And we know that there's a possibility that it won't even happen here in the United States because we're not going to be in compliance with the world government. But that's a topic for another discussion. So, the Sustainable Development Goals, it's aptly named Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So, the goal is a universal policy agenda designed to convert the nations of the world into a global community governed by the seat of world government on the earth today, the United Nations. The agenda is comprised of 17 main goals, and those goals are accompanied by, under each one, 169 focused targets. Some of the goals have 10, some of them have 20. So, and these targets are designed to manage the planet, very detailed. Now, I say that it's socialistic because the scheme includes the socialistic principle of wealth redistribution. Their plan actually claims that the reduction of inequality will only be possible if wealth is shared and income inequality is addressed. totally socialistic. And I also refer to it as global governance of every aspect of every person on the earth, since the plan states that we commit to making fundamental changes in the way that our societies produce and consume goods and services. Governments, international organizations, the business sector, and other non-state actors and individuals must contribute to changing unsustainable consumption and production patterns. So the propaganda is that humans are using the earth's resources at such a rate that nothing will be left for future generations. So what's the solution? Well, the United States, or the United Nations, of course, the world government, must establish a master plan to govern the earth's citizens. And in doing so, they say that it must, number one, in a total socialistic form, redistribute the wealth of the world so that everyone is considered equal. Remember Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, the haves and the have-nots were the problem. It's the same thing here. It must also control the production and consumption of every person on the planet, what you eat, what you produce, how much you eat, how much you produce, electricity, everything. It also must strive to achieve the universal health care, socialistic. Control the climate, that's propaganda from the United Nations. Manage our cities and infrastructure. Govern the oceans and govern land usage along with ecosystems. So these are the Sustainable Development Goals. This, folks, is world government. Now, the problem is the administration of the plan. What's the old saying? I mean, you can't manage what you can't measure. So again, consider the size of this effort. There are approximately 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people on the earth today. Target 8 of goal number 3 is to achieve universal health care. How do you roll out such a system of universal health care and monitor it effectively? You can't go by names because there are tens of thousands of John Smiths just in the United States alone, much less over in Europe and elsewhere. So that's why the only conceivable solution to track the administration of this plan is to ensure that every human being on the planet has a unique identification number. Doesn't matter how rich you are, doesn't matter your education, it doesn't matter how poor you are. If you live in a hut with dirt floors somewhere, they want every person to have a unique identification number. Now, you have to understand that the only reason you would number people is to control them. And again, it seems harmless in the beginning, but imagine if I numbered everybody listening to me this afternoon, and I 1 through whatever, 1,500, and I controlled you by them numbers. It was up to me whether you bought and sold, and I said, number 18, you're not complying with my edicts, so I'm invalidating your number. You see, it can be used as a method of control. If I don't know your number, I can't control you. So it seems harmless in the beginning, but there's coming a time when it will transition into a system of control. And I'm going to show you how that's possible here in just a bit. Now, when we think of these 17 goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, with all of these targets underneath each one, Goal 16, Target 8, and Goal 16, Target 9, under those, the Transforming Our World 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, in the preamble, it states, as we embark on this collective journey, or global governance, multilateralism, we pledge that no one will be left behind. So Goal 16, Target 8, and 16, Target 9 of the Sustainable Development Goals, they both strive to include every person on the earth in this ever-expanding global governing system of the United Nations. 16.8 it states that we want to broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institution of global governance. Why did they state developing countries? Because they believe that the developed countries on the earth are already working in the institutions of global governance. The people that they're trying to number are the majority of them, if not all of them, are in underdeveloped or non-developed nations. The developed nations, they consider them already numbered. So they're already part of and working towards the system of global governance. And then Goal 16, Target 9 says that by 2030, we want to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. So in order for the elite to establish a true global government, in their mind, it must include every single person on the planet. And it makes no difference if, like I said, if they live in the jungle or if they exist in the slums of an inner city and they make up the poorest of the poor. It doesn't matter. And, you know, one can understand the desire to help the poor. You know, we could offer to give them a bowl of soup or provide them with a bath or a place to sleep for the night or even a pair of shoes. And, you know, that's simply the right thing to do for those that have the means to help the poor. The problem is forcing these individuals to receive, and this is happening on the earth as we speak, forcing these individuals to receive a legal identification papers or an identification number in order for them to gain access to some of these provisions. A bowl of rice. You got your national ID number? If not, sorry. It's happening today, folks. It's been happening for a while now. There are major efforts being made to implement the Sustainable Development Goals by supplying the poorest people on the planet with their own unique identification number. Some of them don't even live in a house. You say, well, why? Well, they claim that refugees, migrants, and the poor must have a way to identify themselves in order to function in society. But that's not the overall goal. Remember, Goal 16.8 says that we want to broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. So they're drawing every nation into participation in the institutions of global governance. That's the driver. And you see, my friends, in the beginning, the numbering system looks just like an investment in the future of the poor, which is what both the World Bank and the United Nations efforts are focused on. But in the last days, the Antichrist will use it as a method of control. We're proving that we're in the end time. Remember the prophecy, everybody, rich and poor, free and bond, is going to be given a number without which they won't be able to buy or sell. They're not going to be able to function in society without their number. We're watching this happen now. You say, well, is the mark of the beast being doled out now? No, because the Antichrist has not usurped authority over the world government and using it as a system of control for everyone. But we're watching a precursor. We're in the end time to this very system. Remember, none of this was possible until the invention of the computer and more specifically the internet within the last, 4 or 5 decades. So let's focus on the United Nations effort. Even though the World Bank is working right along with them, I want to focus specifically on ID 2020. The first ID 2020 summit was held back in May of 2016 at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The summit brought together 400 people from 150 private sector companies and 11 UN agencies to discuss how to provide a unique digital identity to everyone on the planet, including the 1 to 1.5 billion people living without any form of recognized identification. Some of the companies in attendance were Bloomberg, Brigham Young University, Cisco Systems, Cornell University, Ernst & Young, Forbes, Google, IBM, JP Morgan, Microsoft with Bill Gates. Bill Gates, have you noticed Bill Gates' name has come up a lot lately? I mean, I think he's pretty much done with Microsoft and he's doing he's using his money to get into all kinds of stuff and kind of sinister, it seems like, doesn't it? Well, Microsoft was involved, of course, Bill Gates, NASDAQ, and I might add that Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation also helps fund the World Bank's digital ID initiative, ID40. They're involved in both of these efforts. So the two main outcomes from the meeting were, this original ID 2020 summit, were that there was widespread consensus among the ID 2020 attendees that identity is both a fundamental right, human right, and a necessary prerequisite for the success of the Sustainable Development Goals. And sweeping commitments from conference attendees to contribute towards the shared goal of a universal digital identity. That was the goal of the entire meeting. So, did you catch that, though? The world government, the United Nations, views a universal digital identity as an absolute necessity for the success of their global governing scheme to transform the world by 2030. We're marching right along the prophecies of the Bible here, everybody. And so you say, well, why identity? Well, ID2020.org answers that question. So they say that this digital ID, why is that so important? Well, they say it's a fundamental right. Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it stipulates that everyone has a right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. The Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 to 2030 include Target 16.9, which aims to provide legal identity to all, including birth registration by 2030. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? But there's always this ulterior motive behind it that you got to think about, and we're going to get off into that big time here in just a minute. So they also say that a digital ID is necessary to access basic services. And this is where they kind of tie you in. You need a digital identity, and they say that individuals are required to show identification to access healthcare, education, to vote, to access other social assistance programs, even to get a job where you're going to be able to pay taxes and this, that, and the other. Basically, to function in society, the United Nations believes you need a digital ID in order to do that, or you're pretty much invisible. Well, I'd much rather be invisible, but I have a debit card. I have a bank account. I've got a job, so I need to pay taxes. So to function in society, I have a number as well. Today, it's my Social Security number. They also say that a digital ID is critical for accountability and governance. Governments without an accurate system of identification struggle to provide well-coordinated social services simply because the number of beneficiaries is unknown and precise targeting is impossible. And without clear registries, the risk of leakages and corruption are very high. In Nigeria, enrollment of civil servants saved approximately 74 million, they say, by eliminating ghost workers on payroll. And they say digital identity is a must because it's a gateway to economic opportunity. Now, you think if you're living in one of the nations that they target is Africa, if you're living out in the bush in Africa and you fish every day for a meal and you're living in a hut with dirt floors, you could care less about having a bank account. I mean, think about it. But some of these people will come into town one time a day to get a bowl of rice. And they're making those people get a national ID number to do that. Or they'll say, we've got to get them involved in the banking system and we've got to get them involved in society, but you got to have a number. So they're saying that it's necessary for a gateway to economic opportunity. More than 2.5 billion adults do not have a bank account or use formal financial services. That's almost a third of the planet. And they say it makes it difficult to move out of poverty or weather a period of hardship. So connecting people with digitally based financial tools and services requires accessible, secure, and verifiable ID systems. You notice everything that the United Nations is doing is pushing people in this ID 2020, ID 4D, they're pushing people towards being involved in a digital system. You got to have a digital number to function in society. This digital, because they cannot track you unless you're included in this digital database. Now, they also say that it's important for gender equality. Women with an official identity are empowered to play a greater role in household decisions and maintain financial independence. And furthermore, identification can be an important defense against child marriage, exploitation, and trafficking. So if they all had an ID, they say, hey, it can stop all that. And I think they're dreaming, but we'll see. They also say that a digital ID is a must because it's a key enabler of global development. In addition to the intrinsic benefit of identity, it is a necessary prerequisite for achieving many of the other sustainable development goals. International goals will be difficult to reach or measure without a way of identity to identify the beneficiaries. So let me pause here for just a moment, because I want you to notice these similarities with the ID 2020 project and the prophecy mentioned of the mark of the beast in Revelation 13, 16 through 18. According to this prophecy, in the end time, the Antichrist is going to cause everyone on earth to receive their own unique identification number in order to function in society. And it will be implemented to such a degree that without this number, you're not going to be able to buy or sell. You're not going to be able to function in society. Now consider these explanations that is provided by the ID 2020 project for the identification of every person on the earth. It's necessary to access basic services such as healthcare, education, and other social assistance programs. It's also necessary for critical accountability and governance. And it's necessary to access to a bank account or other financial services. For instance, if the global community were to transform into a cashless society, it would make it impossible for an individual without proper ID to function in society. Well, we're headed off into a cashless society as we speak, a cashless global society. A big majority of purchases today are done digitally, not cash. And then also legal identity is necessary for the implementation of the at least 10 of sections of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now remember, the Sustainable Development Goals are a socialistic blueprint by the United Nations to govern the planet. And they say you and I need this a legal digital identity to participate in them and to help them fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals. It sounds just like the Bible prophecy. Revelation 13, 16 through 18. So folks, we're way off into the end time. We're not in the beginning. We're coming to the culmination of this whole thing. Now, the UN stats says that in their document, implementation of the United Nations Legal Identity Agenda, the United Nations Country Team, this was located in their operational guidelines. Legal identity is acknowledged to be catalytic for achieving at least 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the data generated from civil registrations and population registers support measures of over 60 of the development goal indicators, those targets. So without a digital ID for every person on the planet, it's going to be impossible for them to succeed in these Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. So now you can see how important it is to the world government, the United Nations, that every person on earth is given their own unique identification number. Without that numbering system, virtually impossible to implement and to monitor, to manage the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, a global identity system. That's where That's the goal. The effort to establish a new universal identity database is the goal behind ID 2020, ID 4D, and all the other efforts. Those are the main two. And that's why John Edge, he's the co-founder of the global initiative ID 2020. He recruited the help of the United Nations, all of their agencies, non-governmental organizations, technology companies, and banks to see if they could come up with a solution by 2020, this year. According to the Huffington Post, one of the most intriguing and radical ideas is a new kind of identity system based on blockchain technology, which could bring together different programs to create this new universal identity database. Blockchains, which first helped account and to authenticate Bitcoin cryptocurrency, it basically is a decentralized ledgers that track transactions and digital assets, whether it's currency, stocks, bonds, or now identity details. The network is made up of a chain of computers, and each of which have a copy of the ledger and can see if changes have occurred. So blockchains are thought to be secure because all computers must verify and approve each transaction as it takes place. So a hacker supposedly couldn't get to every single computer, and so on the identity blockchain, individuals could store their data on in a sort of a locker or an escrow account, allowing people to access it on a need-to-know basis. And this system, it's seen as a great advantage to refugees and migrants, since they would no longer be reliant on their national government, which they may have had to flee in a wartime scenario, for legal identity. However, there is a danger with digital ID databases. McKinsey Global Institute states, whereas traditional IDs place some technical limits on the control that institutions can enforce on individuals, due to the difficulty of identifying targeted individuals in all situations and purposefully excluding them from critical services, digital ID might allow for surveillance and political control to manifest in new ways. Think about a future world government with the Antichrist at the helm. For example, authoritarian regimes could use digital ID systems to tie political loyalty to access to critical government or private sector services, making them exclude people that didn't want to be included. And through purposeful exclusion of targeted individuals, such as political dissidents or ethnic minorities, regimes could dramatically increase the efficacy of existing systems of surveillance and repression. Well, in the future, what if you're a Christian and you don't want to pledge allegiance to anything but Jesus Christ? They could invalidate your number. You don't want to be a part of this? Well, if they invalidate your number, how are you going to function in a cashless society? It goes right along with the prophecies of the Bible. Now, I've read several articles stating that blockchain is impenetrable and therefore unhackable. I mean, if you're going to have all of your personal identification in these ledgers, that thing better be foolproof, right? MIT Technology Review states that while blockchain technology has been long touted for its security under certain conditions, it can be quite vulnerable. Sometimes shoddy execution can be blamed, or unintentional software bugs. Other times, it's more of a gray area, the complicated result of interactions between the code, the economics of the blockchain, or human greed at some point. That's been known in theory since the technology's beginning. And now that so many blockchains are out in the world, we are learning what it actually means, but often the hard way. So they claim blockchain has no central database too. I mean, I've read tons of articles, no central database. However, in ID 2020, It may not be that way according to the director of ID 2020. Fast Company. They published an article, The Radical Plan for a Global Identity System for a World with Shifting Borders. They say, one of the most intriguing and radical ideas is a new kind of identity system based on the blockchain technology, which could bring together diversified programs to create this new universal identity database. But according to Dakota Gruner, the exact details of how a new global identity system would work are still that's to be worked out. Dakota Gruner is ID 2020's executive director. And listen at this. She imagines that it would evolve into a database overseen by an internationally non-aligned organization like the United Nations. Imagine the United Nations, the seat of world government, being in control of the database that has all access to all the unique identification numbers globally. And then somebody much worse than Adolf Hitler usurping control over that system. You don't want to comply? Invalidate your number. And it goes on to say that it would be flexible enough to encompass every country's existing rules and structures, but accessible to individuals with their own smartphones. So, the GP Group, they published an article, On the Road to Digital Identity. They say for several years now, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, they have been developing a biometric identification system to register displaced persons and refugees. Pilots in Malawi and Thailand have proved very successful, but they have yet to roll out the project on a wider scale, and the database only gives registrants an ID that is recognized by, here it is again, the United Nations, not global governments. Each individual government in their nation, only by the United Nations. Patrick Spence, who is a blockchain consultant with the accounting and consulting firm PwC in London, he imagines that multiple commercial custodians would play different roles of the ID 2020 project. And indeed, there are several startups already offering blockchain-based identity services like ShowCard and Blockstack. But he says still there are significant barriers to establishing a universal ID system. He says a global protocol would be needed, like HTTP is to the web or SMTP is to email. But he says, in the end, without a large global institution like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund taking charge of this, startups are only going to remain startups. But at the same time, national governments would have to agree to give up some control over their ID making initiatives, passing the power to the network and to individuals. So what is clear is that the current system of nation-based IDs isn't serving a large number of people, and even when people are identified, their records are open to abuse by the officials. Now, before we leave this, I want you to notice 2 points. Dakota Gruner, the director of ID 2020. Go type in Dakota Gruner, ID 2020. There, she's got videos all over YouTube explaining all this in great detail. She stated the global identity system would evolve into a database overseen by an internationally non-aligned organization like the United Nations. The United Nations is the seat of world government in the earth today. And then, of course, Patrick Spence. He believes the establishment of a universal ID system has many hurdles to cross, and without a large global institution like the United Nations or the IMF taking charge of certain aspects of the project, such as this global identity protocol, startups, things that are trying to track this, they're only going to remain startups. So both parties recognize the need for a universal numbering system overseen by the world government. Remember, the prophecy states, and he calls us all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand and in their foreheads. Well, Tech Republic, back in 2017, they published an article, why blockchain could be your next form of ID as a world citizen, not as a United States citizen or an Israeli citizen or a New Zealand citizen, a world citizen. Blockchain is moving from banking to the refugee crisis. And you say, well, did the United Nations come up with this refugee crisis? Well, remember the Hegelian dialectic. Create a crisis, you've already got the solution, see the response from the public, and then you offer the solution. In this case, a global numbering system. So as Microsoft and Accenture announced a partnership to use the technology to provide a legal form of identification for this 1.1 billion people worldwide as part of this global public-private partnership ID 2020, these two tech giants developed a prototype that taps Accenture's blockchain capabilities and runs on Microsoft's Azure. And listen at this. The tech tool uses a person's biometric data, such as a fingerprint, remember the prophecy, a mark in your hand, or an iris scan, your forehead. And they use these to unlock record-keeping blockchain technology and create a legal ID. So this will allow refugees to have a personal identity record that they can access from an app on a smartphone, to receive assistance from border crossings, and you say, well, what? Well, remember the database overseen by the UN. Remember what Dakota Gruner talked about. How's that border crossing in the southern United States going to recognize somebody from Syria? There's got to be a database. Well, to the border crossings or to access basic services such as healthcare, according to this press release. So, mark in your hand, forehead, fingerprints, iris scan. The prophecy goes on to say, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark. So imagine, think about the prophecy and imagine the United Nations, the world. Whenever I say United Nations, think world government. So imagine the world government, the United Nations, being able to control what you buy or sell. Some would say, oh, that's not possible, Dave, come on. Well, think again. It's happening already. In the news source Overture, they published an article, Building a Better Food Aid Network with Blockchain. So they're using the blockchain technology, and they're using it and controlling what people buy or sell. How? Well, the United Nations, the World Food Program, WFP, and they have a small team of operates that, with the nimbleness of a startup, to distribute aid for food funds to more than 100,000 Syrian refugees using blockchain technology. The same technology they're considering for ID 2020, and it's called building blocks. The team of UN staff, software developers, and experienced aid workers focuses on delivering food aid to these refugees as rapidly as possible. So the ultimate goal of the project is to reach hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees stranded in Jordan and other places. So according to the development officials, Building Blocks is the largest deployment to date of the blockchain technology for the humanitarian purposes. If they're successful, the project could spread across the UN's multiple agencies and various international partners tasked with the feeding and housing of millions of people fleeing political strife and catastrophes, not just in Syria, but around the world. So the program integrates blockchain with biometric technology, again, fingerprints, iris scan, to create digital profiles unique to each family. The residents, now here's where we get into the buying and selling, the controlling of the United Nations. The residents don't have to rely on having cash on hand or a physical debit card to go shopping. They left war-torn Syria. They fled to Jordan and other places. Many of them didn't even take money. But these people don't have to worry about that. Instead, to buy food and supplies, camp residents stare into an iris scanner when they take their food up to the grocery store. They stare into an iris scanner at the register to verify their identity. Here it is. In the blink of an eye, the scanner cross-checks their identity against a United Nations database, which queries their account and allows them to purchase what they need. So imagine if the United Nations invalidated their access. No groceries, no health care, no education. And then at the end of the transaction, they receive a text message via their cell phone informing them of their balance, plus a receipt of what they've just spent. The United Nations, the world government, controlling the buying and selling of Syrian refugees, hundreds of thousands of them. You see how far we all are off into the end time, everybody? Now, another factor is to move towards a cashless society in our world. I promise you, all of you understand that. Most of us don't use cash anymore. And, a question is that by accident or is it by grand design? Have you ever heard of the Better Than Cash Alliance? Well, it's an organization based at the United Nations. Where else? The world government. The Better Than Cash Alliance is a partnership of governments, companies, and international organizations that accelerates the transition from cash to digital payments. Why would they want to do that? To advance the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the United Nations Socialistic Blueprint for World Government. This organization, Better Than Cash Alliance, exists solely to take nations from cash to digital payments to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. Cash is not trackable. Neither are people who use cash. It reduces their digital footprint, but they're not trackable. The United Nations don't want that. They want everybody on the planet to have a digital ID so they can track you. Eventually, the Antichrist is going to be able to invalidate your number, keeping you from having access to society. So the world government wants everyone to go cashless to force you into a digital global society. You say, well, how is that going to work? Well, a few years ago, I think it was back in 2017, Forbes. You've heard of the news source Forbes. Well, they published an article, India is likely to become the first digital cashless society. This was 2017. Now we're in 2020, 3 years later. In the article, Forbes stated the top news out of India over the past 12 months has been Prime Minister Modi's move to ban 85% of the currency in circulation. Imagine that, 85%. They've got over 1 billion people. How are those people going to function? One day you get up and he says, 85% of the currency gone. The paper money you have is just monopoly money. However, something much more far-reaching has happened. It's called India Stack. Before 2009, half of all Indians didn't have any form of identification, not even a birth certificate. So without a form of identification, now you say, why did they want to go cashless? Well, there was an ulterior motive behind that. They said that without a form of identification, they wanted everybody to get on this identification program that they were going to launch. But a lot of people were kind of dragging their feet. So without a form of identification, citizens couldn't access services to banking, insurance, even get a driver's license. So as such, many opportunities like starting a business were not available to them. Well, then in 2009, India launched their Aadhaar identification system. Aadhaar is this biometric database based on a 12-digit digital identity authenticated by, here it is again, fingerprints in your hand, retinal scan in your forehead. And how did John know 2,000 years ago it was going to be in your hand and your forehead? God told him. God knows the end from the beginning. So, This ADHAR system became the largest and most successful ID project ever. Imagine numbering 1 billion people and tracking them. So as of 2016, 1.1 billion people, 95% of India's population, had a digital proof of identity. But ADHAR was just the beginning. In 2016, India added another component to this digitalized system called India Stack. India Stack is a series of secured and connected systems that allow people to store and share personal data such as your addresses, your bank statements. I don't want the government seeing my bank statement. Employment records, your tax filings, everything. And this is all accessed and can be shared via the ADHAR identification system digital identification system in India. India Stack allows citizens to open a bank account or brokerage account and buy a mutual fund or share medical records anywhere in India with just a fingerprint or a retinal scan from ADHAR. Now, here we get off into the cashless part. To put it simply, India Stack could be the framework for a new digital society. And a cashless world would be made possible. So now, back to the biggest Indian news story of the past year. This is according to Forbes. This was in 2017. Prime Minister Modi's cash ban. Modi's move to demonetize the country was viewed as an isolated event. Well, Prime Minister Modi just got up and axed 85% of the cash. That wasn't the goal. According to Forbes, however, it was the action of doing away with the cash that forced everyone into the new digital identity system. A lot of people were dragging their feet. I don't want to get into that digital system. Well, I tell you what I'll do. I'll just eliminate cash. So we axed 85% of the cash in India. And Forbes said it was that action that forced everyone into the new digital identity system. Since ADHAR was launched, there have been 270 million bank accounts opened in India. So it was that move, the move to cashless, that forced everyone into that digital identity system. Now you can understand why the United Nations is promoting the move towards a cashless global society. Remember the Better Than Cash Alliance? It's a partnership of governments, companies, and international organizations that accelerates this transition from cash to digital payments to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations socialistic blueprint to govern every person on the planet by 2030. You say, well, why is this huge move on the planet to get everybody cashless? Because they want you involved in their digital ID plan. Now, is this the mark of the beast? Well, according to Patrick Spence, ID 2020 is this global strategic initiative aimed to help deliver against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of legal identification for every person on the planet. Now, although it did not reach a conclusion on the exact system that would be used to administer such a project, the ID 2020 Summit is going to be held annually until 2030 with that objective in mind, numbering every person. At this point, we cannot say for sure whether the efforts of ID 2020 will result in this global numbering system. They're marching straight forward like it is. And that's the one that's going to be one day used for the Antichrist to usurp authority over. At this point, with the ID 2020, the United Nations effort, and with ID 40, the World Bank's effort, it looks like that's what's going to happen. And so this is what we know for sure. The Bible prophesies that a world government will be established in the near future, which will be ruled by the Antichrist. And once the Antichrist assumes control, he will use a global numbering system to economically sanction every person on the earth to conform to his dictatorial edicts. And it is possible, I say it's possible because something else could come out of the woodwork that we haven't seen and implements this. I don't see anything on the horizon other than these two huge initiatives, ID 2020 and ID 40. But it is possible that ID 2020 could be successful in creating this universal digital identity structure, including the small, the great, the rich, the poor, the free, the bond, which could someday be taken over by the future world tyrant, the Antichrist. And you say, when is all this going to happen? Well, I take the mark of the beast if I take this number. Not right now. Again, right now, it's just they're saying it's a numbering system that the United Nations is going to oversee. But when the Antichrist comes on the scene, halfway through the final 7 years, usurps authority over the world government, the United Nations, and the global governing body. Once that event happens, then that will be the catalyst that launches us into the final 3.5 years before the second coming of Jesus Christ in the Battle of Armageddon, which will be the Great Tribulation. That's when the Antichrist will take control of an existing numbering system, which they're setting up right now, which will be managed, according to Dakota Gruner, of the director of ID 2020, by the United Nations. And he's going to take control of that, and he's going to say, okay, you X group of individuals, you don't want to participate, you don't want to bow down to my edicts, I'll invalidate your number. You won't be able to function in society. Or you group of political people, you don't want to comply, I'll invalidate your number. It's that the Bible says, Revelation 13, 16 through 18, that's exactly what's going to happen. And the biometric identifiers of this system right now is fingerprints in your hand, iris scan in your forehead, your hand and your forehead. So, remember, it hasn't been possible until the invention of a computer and the internet. This is how we're going to track everything. Remember the blockchain technology. So, are we in the end time? Wow. Man, we're there. I mean, honestly, everybody, I've taken, about an hour now? And this is just, I could really spend the rest of the day just on this. And there's so many, this is just one of the many ongoing prophetic fulfillments that we're watching right now. And, are we living in the end time? Man, you better believe we are. And one of the most important things, you say, well, what should I be doing? Well, you need to prepare yourself mentally for the times just ahead. You need to understand these things, and you need to explain them to your friends, family, and your sphere of influence. And you need to, number one, prepare yourself to meet the Lord. He's coming back very soon. We are the generation that will see the return of Jesus Christ to the earth. I know the Bible says, that, there will be people in the end time that say, I've heard that for years. The Bible says there will be scoffers that say, I've heard about the coming of the Lord since the beginning of time. Well, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen right at the end of some of these events that are being set up right now. So how do you prepare? Well, the best way to prepare, Bible study. We have hundreds of prophecy groups meeting around the world, online, in houses, all over the place. You need to be in one of those Bible study groups, and it's totally free. And for you and your family, you can join, no cost. You have Bible study teachers all over the world that want to teach you. Now, I want to encourage you to join one of these groups, even start a group of your own. Because knowledge is the key. The Bible says in the end, they that understand among the people shall instruct many. That's our job. Furthermore, if you want to work through our prophecy resources at your own pace, anywhere, anytime, the courses are only, $59 a semester, and you get immediate access when you enroll. So we have one more session today coming up. I hope you've enjoyed this and the other sessions. But we've got one more session today at 5 o'clock p.m. Central Time. We're here in Dallas, Texas. And Irvin and I will be answering many of your questions that you guys have submitted in the last few weeks. So I'm looking forward to that.